My name is Mark Morton. I'm the Senior Instructional Developer in the Center for Teaching Excellence at the University of Waterloo, and I have the privilege of talking to Dr. Veronica Kitchen about how she uses simulations in one of her courses. So, Veronica Kitchen, you're teaching a course, Poli-Sci 281, I believe, and Catherine Lithgow was telling me that in that course you're making use of what she was calling simulations. And when I first heard that, I thought she meant like very high-tech online Java-based simulations, but I take it that's not the case. So can you tell me what are simulations?
Simulations, I would distinguish actually between simulations and games. So I would call games an activity, an active learning activity where students very often get up and move around the classroom that's designed to illustrate or reinforce or introduce a concept or spark discussion. A simulation, in my mind, is a little more involved. It usually involves the students taking on a role and trying to solve a problem. So in my classroom we do a mix of both. The games usually in the larger classroom situation. My class this year is about 90 students. In the simulations typically in a tutorial where there's only about 20 students, and so you can do something that has a little more content, a little more complexity with a much smaller group.
And can you tell us about the simulations in your course? What do they involve? What do they entail?
So it's a world politics course, so I use several different simulations for different things. So for instance, this year we started off the course with a simulation to use as an icebreaker. And this is something that I do not just in my second year world politics course, but also in my upper year course, my seminar courses, as a way to remind students that the tutorial setting and the seminar setting are not about me, the instructor, delivering information to them. It's really about them. They're the ones who should be talking, they're the ones who should be interacting with the material, and so by starting off the seminar with a simulation, it serves two functions. One, students really get to know each other, and they get used to the idea that they're going to have to talk in class. So the simulation that I use this year is actually a simulation that I wrote based on my research, and so it's a crisis simulation where students represent government officials in Canada, from the provincial government of Quebec, and from the United States government, and they have to deal with an attempted terrorist attack at the Montreal airport. And so they each have a defined set of courses of action they could take, which correspond to things that those actual government actors could do, and they have to choose the appropriate response to this crisis and work through the crisis.
With each other.
With each other, and so they learn how to interact with each other and make a decision within their team, and then because there's 3 teams, they also have to communicate across the teams and decide, you know, if you have a potential terrorist attack, there's obviously a series of things that have to happen in the correct order. You can't send in the bomb diffusion squad until you've evacuated the airport. You probably don't need to ground flights in Vancouver. You may need to ground flights, though, in Quebec. And so you start to think about what are appropriate responses, but also, because they're given a defined list, think about what kinds of things do different parts of the government do.
And how does a simulation in this sense differ from, let's say, a case study?
So students in the simulation are really taking on the role. I think a case study could be a simulation, but in this case, they're assigned a role. In this particular case, they're assigned a role either just as a member of the government of Canada or the provincial government of Quebec or the government of the United States. But I have also done simulations where they're specifically told, you are the Secretary of State. You are thinking from the Secretary of State's position, what would the Secretary of State do in that position? In a case, so you're really immersed inside the character. In a case study, you may be looking outside and inside at the same time. In a simulation, we usually save the outside looking in for the debrief. The other difference I would say is part of the goal in a simulation is to put students in situations of stress. We can never in a classroom duplicate the kind of stress that a real policymaker would have on the job, but we can simulate it. We can give them a little bit of the stress and make them understand that sometimes people have to make decisions with incomplete information, with short timelines, when they don't really know what's going on, when they don't really know what other actors are doing. And all of those things are true to life. And my experience is the best way to teach that to a student is to put them into one of those situations rather than just sort of have a discussion about a case study where all of the emotional content is laid out in front of you, but you're not necessarily experiencing it.
So I assume that this kind of content could be taught, or probably has many times been taught in the past, in a sort of traditional transmission-based approach, where students are being told by the instructor, this is what you do in this situation, here are the protocols. Why do it? Can you say more about why the simulation approach is more effective?
I think until somebody is telling you you have 5 minutes to make a decision, it's hard to understand decision under a time crunch. You can teach the concept of groupthink, for instance, but until you've got 3 of your teammates telling you, no, we've made the decision, you need to go along with us, it's difficult, I think, to appreciate the dynamics of groupthink. So I think I've thought of it as a mode of experiential learning. I mean, it's an inferior mode of experiential learning, but since in many courses, in many political situations, you can't put a student actually into a high crisis situation. So the best way to elicit that emotional content and for them to really experience the concepts we're learning about in the classroom is through simulation.
So it really sounds like that emotional aspect of the simulation is very important. And I think studies have shown that when students are learning something that provokes an emotional response in them, the learning is deeper, it's retained longer, so that's important to the simulation.
Absolutely, and certainly my students often tell me that they remember what happened in simulations, and it comes back weeks later, things that we've done earlier in the semester.
And how do you prepare the students themselves for these simulations? I assume that many come to your course and they have never engaged in a simulation in a university course. Do you prepare them for it, and if so, how?
In some cases I don't prepare them for it because I don't want to tell them what the goal of the simulation is, except to just basically explain the instructions. So for instance, I do an activity with them where they each receive a playing card and they play rock, paper, scissors, and the winner of rock, paper, scissors gets the other person's playing card. And the ultimate goal is to model sort of the state of nature as we theorize in international relations through the idea of classical realism and the idea that states are out to look after their own survival. Human nature is inherently violent. And so I simply give them the instruction, you have a playing card, here's how to win other playing cards, your goal is to survive. And of course then what we talk about is the fact that they all, despite the fact that they've just been told their goal is to survive, and the rational response would be to sit still and not play the game with anybody, they nonetheless go out and play the game and try to win more cards. And that gives us a platform then to talk about things like greed and the fact that sometimes you have to react if somebody else challenges you to a rock, paper, scissors duel. So in that case, I really I want the discussion to come afterwards. I don't want to introduce it. And so my students know when I pull out my deck of playing cards, something is coming, but they don't always know what, and sometimes that's for the best.
So it's like you want to maximize the discovery aspect.
Exactly, and I want to get their immediate reactions. I don't want to prime them to react a certain way.
Right.
Except that sometimes I do want to prime them to react a certain way, and so in that case, for something like a role play simulation where I've asked them to take on the role of a member of the United Nations or a member of a refugee group that's experienced violent conflict, then I will usually give them a group handout beforehand that sort of explains the context of the simulation, and then I will often give them a paragraph or two about the individual or the group that they themselves are meant to be portraying. In some cases, I don't usually do this, but I know a lot of people who then integrate that into assignments. They don't give the students the information about their role. They ask them to go out and research their role. I haven't done that recently. I did used to do that in a class. But that way it saves time at the beginning of the class explaining it. If everybody, theoretically at least, has read the context of the simulation before, say, a 1-hour tutorial, that means you have the full hour to play out the simulation and to debrief the simulation.
So you intentionally don't prep the students for the simulation, but then they do the simulation, and then you're saying it's during the debrief afterwards in which you're guiding them through a sort of reflection upon what they have learned?
Exactly, and I in that case, I usually know what I want to get out of the debriefing. I know what the objective of the simulation was. Is it to illustrate classical realism? Is it to illustrate collective action problems? Is it to illustrate decision-making under pressure? But I want those ideas to come out of the discussion, because I think if students can make the translation from what they have experienced up to the abstract concept, then they've learned it for themselves. And I think sometimes that helps them to see why it's a theory that makes sense to people, rather than just feeding them the theory and asking them to go out and look for places to apply it, which I also do. But I think if students can see sort of real life or a simulation of real life and abstract the concept, A, as you say, it's maybe more likely to stick with them. And B, they've generated that concept for themselves. They aren't being told that's what you should see, that's what they actually did see.
Do the simulations ever go awry, and just result in more confusion?
Nuclear war.
Is that good or bad?
It's a joke, but yeah, I mean, the joke is you give international relations students enough leeway, and eventually the world will be destroyed by nuclear weapons. So yeah, I mean, sometimes they do go awry in the sense that students get carried away, which can be good or bad, and depending on the learning goal, you may have to rein them in order to get where you wanted to go, or you can, in some cases, you may just be able to let them go. But I mean, presumably you're doing a simulation because there's a particular learning objective you want to meet, and so if it goes off the rails, you may have to rescue it, intervene. Other things I've had gone wrong in role play simulations, I love to introduce a spy. Very often the spy will reveal themselves at the beginning and be like, even if you've told them explicitly this is private information, or someone won't prepare. And you just have to be ready for all that. They're students. You can assign the roles very, very carefully, and pick your best students to play the key role, and then they had a bad night's sleep, or they're preparing for an exam, or they had an upset stomach, and they're just not going to step up and play that role. And often you'll be surprised. Someone else will step up and play that role. A character that you never intended to be pivotal may become pivotal. So I find actually, as often as simulations don't live up to my expectations and students don't live up to my expectations, other students will often exceed them.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever encounter students who perhaps come to the course and they are expecting and wanting you to lecture to them, and their response to the simulation is, this is not what I'm paying my tuition for? Like, is that
It's a game. It's dumb.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very occasionally I do, but I think you need to. That's why you need to integrate it into the course by explaining to students either beforehand or during the debrief as appropriate what the point of the simulation was. You need to have a point to the simulation. You don't do the simulation unless there's a learning goal. And in the debrief, you make sure to connect it to class concepts. I build it into my assignments. One of the assignments is a simulation reflection, and it's explicitly explained to them that this is about thinking about how you connect concepts we've learned in class to quasi-real life. And sometimes it shows up on the exam. Sometimes you can get data out of a simulation. For instance, I often do a simulation. It's a prisoner's dilemma simulation, and so students are asked to repeat a basic prisoner's dilemma scenario several times, and I can then, they fill in a response card. I can aggregate the data from that, and you can then ask your students questions about that data, about how the class acted as a whole on an exam or a test. So I think that if you properly integrate a simulation into a course, you can minimize that this is just a game response. But on the other hand, students really like the opportunity to get up, move around, to play a game. So I think most of them are receptive to that. They see it as a nice break from the transmission method of learning.
Can you say a little bit more about the integration aspect of it. For example, how many simulations do you do in a course? How many marks are they assigned? You know, the sort of nitty-gritty details.
So this year I've actually integrated more than I ever have before, and I did that because I've started to integrate easy simulations into the lecture period. I have a meet pattern where I have a 2-hour lecture plus a 1-hour tutorial. That gives me enough time to have a class discussion during the lecture portion of the class. So we actually did, I think, 5 or 6 this year, including the one that basically functions as an icebreaker at the beginning. Some of them are really quick. The game plus the discussion takes up the first 30 to 40 minutes of class, but it provides a really solid foundation for the rest of the lecture then, because I can we've extrapolated the key concepts, and so I can refer back to the simulation as the lecture goes on. In some cases, you may need to provide an incentive for students to participate. So, for instance, we played a game last week that's a model of the collective action problem where students had to put a puzzle together, and they got more points if their group solved the puzzle, but they didn't contribute their puzzle piece. So it sets up a classic collective action problem. But in order to make it work, there's got to be a real stake. The students got to have a real stake to not participate, or some at least students do. And so I told them that they could receive up to 3% of their final grade bonus on their participation mark. So they got 1 point for having their piece left over, and if the group solved the puzzle, they could get another 2. So there was a maximum of 3 points that they could accumulate. As I say, I also integrated into assignments. And that again provides an incentive for students to participate and really think about the learning. But mostly it's integrated into my class participation mark with that extra little incentive. There might be a question on the final exam, and they write a paper reflecting on their experience with any one of the simulations. In my mind, some of them would have done that early in the semester. In practice, they've all left it to the end of the semester.
Just one final question. This course is political science, as you were saying. There will be instructors watching this who are teaching history or chemistry, philosophy, engineering. Do you think that simulations are something that can work in any discipline, any course?
I think they can. In history, the parallels are pretty clear. I mean, there's a big tradition of, you know, the Model UN, the historic treaty making session. From the military, there's the idea of the staff ride, which is a military teaching tool where you take students to a battlefield and they take on the role of a character and they explain while standing on a battlefield. You know, they talk about the logistics while you're overlooking the terrain. They talk about the offense-defense relationship overlooking the terrain. And I think that model could really work anywhere where you've got a lesson associated with a place. I mean, I could see it in an environment course, going to a wetland or going to a site that's been recently rebuilt, architecture, something like that. Just getting out of the classroom and into the community is a different kind of simulation, but again, you could ask students to take on roles. What would the architect have thought? What would have the land use board thought? What would the developer have thought? I mean, a lot of the concepts I teach using simulations in political science are borrowed from economics, like collective action problems and the prisoner's dilemma. So there's some key overlaps there. I mean, science is really, you know, experiments are simulations. So I think they're probably actually way ahead of where we are in art. So yeah, I don't see why they couldn't be integrated into almost any course.
Well, Veronica Kitchen, thank you for telling us about simulations in your course.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.